If you sign page 47, you lose everything, sir. The words did not rise above a conversational tone, yet they cut through the executive boardroom sharper than the silver Mont Blanc pen hovering over the contract. For one suspended second, no one moved. 20 floors above Midtown Manhattan, inside a glass-walled conference room washed in late afternoon light, the city shimmered below like molten steel, but inside the room the air turned still. Richard Whitmore, chief executive of Whitmore Dynamics, held his signature inches from paper and slowly lifted his eyes. Across the polished table, investors from Dubai, Zurich, and Chicago stared in disbelief at the young black assistant who had dared interrupt a $2 billion acquisition 90 seconds before close. Nia Carter remained standing near the side credenza, a slim legal binder pressed against her chest, her ID badge catching a shaft of sun. She had been invisible all morning, pouring coffee, replacing briefing folders, taking notes no one thought she understood. That was how powerful people preferred certain people to exist, useful, silent, unseen. But now every eye in the room was fixed on her. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you say?" he asked, not loud, which somehow made it colder. Nia swallowed once, but her voice did not shake. Subparagraph C in the indemnity rider transfers control rights if there's a compliance trigger. It looks like protection, but it's an override clause. Someone at the far end gave a dry nervous laugh. Another whispered, "Who let staff into this discussion?" Richard leaned back slowly, the leather chair breathing under his weight. He studied her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a junior support analyst from Compliance Overflow, not as the janitor's daughter whose mother once cleaned federal courthouses in Newark, but as a disruption. "Miss Carter," he said, almost amused now, "do you understand you are interrupting a transaction negotiated for 11 months? The room loosened with uneasy chuckles. But Nia didn't sit down. Her fingers tightened around the binder. "Yes, sir. And if you sign it, the buyer can trigger liability. Collapse valuation, and take controlling interest." A silence deeper than embarrassment settled over the room. The Swiss counsel lowered his glasses. A private equity partner stopped scrolling his phone. Even the HVAC hum seemed suddenly loud. Richard's pen tapped once against the paper. Once. Then stopped. He gave a faint smile meant to diminish her. "The janitor's daughter reads corporate law now." This time several people laughed openly. Heat climbed Nia's neck, but she did not retreat. Instead she stepped forward, laid a yellow sticky tab on the open contract, and pointed to a line printed in nearly microscopic type. "Right there." Richard did not look down. Not yet. His pale blue eyes stayed on her, hard and measuring. Somewhere a digital wall clock changed from 4:28 to 4:29. 89 seconds to signing. The sun shifted against the glass, laying bars of gold across the contract. Nia could hear her own heartbeat, but beneath it another sound emerged, the soft unsettled rustle of people beginning to wonder if the girl they had dismissed might be right. And for the first time that afternoon, Richard Whitmore did not appear irritated. He looked uncertain. Then his general counsel leaned forward, adjusting his tie, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Richard, let me see that clause." Richard Whitmore did not touch the pen again. The room held itself together by silence alone as Martin Doyle, general counsel for Whitmore Dynamics, pulled the contract closer, his fingers moving with the care of a surgeon approaching something fragile. His reading glasses slipped lower on his nose. One page turned. Then another. No one reached for water. No one checked a phone. Even the skyline beyond the glass seemed frozen in the amber light. Nia remained standing, though her knees felt unsteady beneath her. She had spoken, and now the machinery of power was either about to crush her or prove her right. Martin traced a paragraph with his index finger, stopped at the yellow tab she had placed, and his expression changed so slightly most missed it. But Richard did not. He saw the pause. He saw the breath his lawyer forgot to take. "Well?" Richard asked, his voice Controlled but thinner now. Martin did not answer immediately. Instead he turned back 3 pages, then forward again, cross-checking the indemnity rider against an annex buried in the disclosures. A private equity partner shifted in his chair. Someone coughed. 78 seconds. Finally Martin looked up. There is a contingent transfer mechanism tied to regulatory default, he said carefully. If triggered, governance rights move to the acquiring party. The words landed like cold rain. One investor muttered, "That cannot be right." Another leaned toward the contract as if proximity might change what was written. Richard's face did not move, but color seemed to drain from it all the same. "You missed this?" he asked Martin, though it sounded less like accusation than disbelief. Martin swallowed. It was disguised through layered references. Deliberately, I think. Across the table, the Zurich delegation exchanged uneasy glances. Their lead negotiator, who had smiled all morning with the ease of a man expecting victory, no longer smiled. Richard turned his attention slowly back to Nia. She felt the weight of it like heat. But beneath the scrutiny something had shifted. He was not looking at a subordinate anymore. He was looking at the person who had stepped between him and disaster. Yet suspicion lingered. "How did you see it?" he asked. Nia hesitated only a moment. "My mother cleaned the federal courthouse in Newark when I was 14. I used to sit in the back of contract hearings after school. Later I studied commercial law before leaving to care for her." She did not add that she had returned at night to finish casebooks while working 2 jobs. She did not need to. The truth already sat on page 47. Richard leaned back, eyes narrowing not in contempt now, but calculation. 3,000 employees, Nia said quietly, almost to herself. If this closed, they could all be exposed. The words traveled farther than she intended. A board member at the far end lowered his head. Another loosened his tie. For months they had spoken of valuation, leverage, efficiencies. No one had spoken of workers. That landed too. Richard's fingers rested flat against the unsigned signature page. Then he did something no one expected. He slid the contract shut. The sound of paper closing echoed louder than it should have. "This signing is suspended," he said. The Zurich negotiator protested at once, too fast, too defensive. Richard lifted a hand and the man fell silent. But as Martin began gathering exhibits, his eyes caught another appendix attached to the deal packet, and his brow furrowed again. "Richard," he said, lower this time, troubled in a different way. "There is something else." Martin Doyle did not look up immediately. His finger remained pressed against a cross-reference buried in the annex schedule, a section none of the directors had examined because it appeared routine, technical, forgettable. But the room no longer trusted anything that looked ordinary. Richard's voice dropped. "What is it?" Martin inhaled slowly. "This transfer trigger is linked to an internal authorization sequence." He turned the packet so Richard could see. Someone inside Whitmore had to pre-approve the contingency path. The words did not explode. They sank, heavier than sound. Across the polished table, the meaning spread in widening circles. Not an outside trap alone. An inside hand. A betrayal. Richard stared at the clause, then at the authorization initials beside the embedded approval code. His hand moved to the edge of the table as if grounding himself. "Whose authorization?" he asked. Martin hesitated, and in that hesitation everyone understood the answer would hurt. "Chief Financial Officer." Several heads turned at once toward Daniel Mercer. Until that moment Mercer had sat composed in a navy suit, silver tie straight, expression professionally bored, the image of loyal competence. Now a faint rigidity touched his shoulders. "This is absurd," Mercer said, attempting a laugh that arrived too late. "A drafting artifact." But no one joined him. Nia felt the temperature in the room drop, though the sunlight had not moved. Richard did not blink. He and Mercer had built the company together over 14 years. Shared earnings calls, crisis flights, hospital visits when Richard's father died. Trust measured in decades sat suddenly under fluorescent scrutiny. "Did you authorize this?" Richard asked. Mercer spread his hands. "Every transaction carries protective contingencies." "Did you authorize this?" Richard repeated, quieter. The second time was worse. Mercer looked toward the Zurich negotiator as if seeking support, but found only distance. Martin pushed another document forward. "There is a side compensation agreement tied to completion." A board member whispered, "My God." Richard's face did not harden. It emptied. The look was almost more frightening. Nia watched his fingers curl once against the leather chair arm, then release. For a moment no one in the room was a billionaire or analyst or foreign investor. They were simply people seeing a truth none had expected. Mercer leaned forward. "Richard, listen to me. This was strategic insulation. You are overreacting because an assistant interrupted a signing." His eyes flicked toward Nia, carrying the old dismissiveness, but now it sounded smaller, brittle. Richard followed the glance and something in him changed. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps recognition. Because the young woman he had mocked as a janitor's daughter had seen what his most trusted executive had concealed. He stood. The chair rolled back softly over carpet. No one else moved. Manhattan glowed copper beyond the glass as the sun lowered behind the Hudson. Richard placed one hand on the closed contract. "Security is not escorting Miss Carter out," he said, never taking his eyes off Mercer. "Security will remain outside until this board determines whether fraud was attempted under my roof." No one breathed. Mercer opened his mouth, then closed it. Martin gathered the annex pages with trembling precision. Nia felt a strange disorientation, as though she were watching the floor tilt under old hierarchies. She had expected humiliation, perhaps termination. Not this. Not the unraveling of an empire's inner circle. Richard turned at last to her. There was no mockery left in his expression. Only a hard unsettled respect, and something wounded behind it. "Miss Carter," he said, voice lower now, "sit at this table." The words landed with a force beyond invitation. A support analyst from the side wall was being asked into the board itself. Nia stepped forward slowly, pulse racing, and took the empty leather chair beside General Counsel. But as she opened the annex packet Martin slid toward her, her eyes caught a handwritten notation in the margin, 6 digits and a date set for tomorrow morning. Her breath stalled. The trap was not over. The handwritten notation sat in the margin like a whisper no one else had heard. 6 digits. A routing code. And beneath it, 10 o'clock tomorrow, asset conversion. Nia felt the words tighten in her chest. This was not debris left from a failed deception. Something remained in motion. While the board absorbed betrayal already exposed, another mechanism was still counting down. She slid the annex closer, reading again to be certain she was not imagining it. Richard noticed before she spoke. "What is it?" he asked. The question carried none of the old hierarchy now. It carried urgency. Nia lifted her eyes. "The transfer may still execute tomorrow through an asset conversion trigger." Martin turned sharply. "That is impossible. The signing was suspended." "Not if the contingency sits outside the acquisition vehicle," Nia said, tracing the notation. "It could move through a shell subsidiary before markets open." Across the table Mercer shifted for the first time with visible discomfort. His hand reached toward his phone, then stopped when Richard saw it. "Do not touch anything," Richard said quietly. The room obeyed the quiet more than any shout. Nia turned the annex toward Martin. "See the routing suffix? It points to Whitmore Infrastructure Holdings, not the parent company." Martin leaned in, reading faster now. A flush crept into his face. "She is right. 2 words, but they altered gravity again. One director removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if the room had become difficult to focus. Outside the windows, the Hudson burned orange under the lowering sun, ferries moving like shadows over molten water. Inside, every second seemed sharpened. Richard looked toward Mercer. "You scheduled a secondary transfer after the signing." Mercer gave a strained smile. "This is becoming theatrical." But the confidence had drained from him. Richard ignored the performance. "Martin, can we freeze it?" Martin considered, lips pressed thin. "Only if Treasury receives injunction notice before close, or if the authorization key is revoked internally." "Who controls the key?" Richard asked. Martin looked at Mercer. The answer needed no voice. A strange stillness followed, not panic but concentrated moral pressure, as though the room itself were deciding what kind of men sat in it. Nia felt old instincts tell her to shrink back, to let executives reclaim the problem. But something stronger rose. "There may be another way," she said. Heads turned again. "The 6 digits are not random. It looks like segmented access. If the final 2 numbers map to internal signatory priority, the code may have been duplicated." Martin blinked. "A mirror authorization." Richard stared at her, astonishment barely hidden. "Can you prove it?" Nia thought of nights in a Newark library copying cases under buzzing fluorescent lights, of studying transaction structures while others slept. "I can try." Richard pushed his chair back from the head of the table and, in a gesture no one would forget, slid the chief executive terminal toward her. "Then use my system." For a heartbeat she did not move. The most protected console in the room sat open before a young black analyst who had entered as invisible support staff that morning. Then she placed trembling fingers on the keyboard. Screens glowed blue across her face. Mercer's breathing sounded suddenly loud. Numbers moved. Audit logs opened. A routing tree unfolded line by line. Martin leaned over one shoulder, following in silence. 30 seconds passed. 40. Then Nia stopped scrolling. There. A mirrored authorization sat nested under Mercer's credentials and time-stamped 2 weeks earlier. But another name sat beside it, hidden until now under encrypted notation. Richard read it and went still. It was not only Mercer. A board member seated 3 chairs from him had signed too. Betrayal had not been one man. It had reached inside the board itself. No one spoke. Then Richard whispered, almost to himself, "I have been sitting among strangers." And the long glass room seemed colder than winter. No one challenged the screen. No one even reached for the printed binders anymore, as though paper belonged to an older reality already collapsing. The second board signature remained glowing on Richard's terminal, impossible to misread. Harold Benton, Senior Director, 40 years in corporate governance, mentor to half the room, sat motionless with both hands folded over a yellow legal pad. His face had gone strangely calm, almost relieved, which unsettled Nia more than denial would have. Richard looked from the screen to Benton with a silence so sharp it seemed to hum. "You too?" he asked. It was not anger. It was injury. Benton lifted his chin. "I advise diversification against concentration risk." His tone held the polished detachment of a man hiding moral fracture behind vocabulary. "You advised a concealed transfer," Martin said, voice tighter now. Benton gave a faint sigh. "Richard built this company around control. Markets punish rigidity." The words might once have sounded strategic. In this room, under this light, they sounded hollow. Mercer seized the opening. "Exactly. We structured leverage protection. Nothing more." But Richard did not turn toward Mercer. His attention remained on Benton, perhaps because betrayal from ambition wounds less than betrayal from trust. Outside, dusk deepened over Manhattan, windows beginning to spark alive in neighboring towers. Inside, the boardroom held the solemn quiet of judgment before verdict. Then Nia noticed something else in the mirrored authorization logs. A pending release sequence linked to offshore settlement channels, timestamp advancing in real time. She leaned closer. The transfer clock is active now. Martin bent toward the monitor. 22 minutes until automated release. The words jolted the room from moral paralysis back into danger. Richard straightened instantly. The old executive force returned, but changed now by humility sharpened through shock. Options. Martin spoke first. Court injunction cannot move in 22 minutes. A director said, shut the server down. Nia shook her head. If the release protocol interprets disruption as hostile interference, it could auto-execute. Mercer's eyes flickered. Too fast. Nia caught it. So did Richard. You knew that, Richard said. Mercer said nothing. For a suspended second everyone understood the only route left was to override the authorization key from within the protocol itself. But the access architecture had been built to prevent unilateral reversal. Unless someone understood how the mirror logic nested. Richard turned toward Nia with no hesitation now. Can you unwind it? Her mouth went dry. Maybe, if the duplicated key has a recursive flaw. Benton almost smiled, weary and strange. You trust her with the company? Richard answered without taking his eyes off Nia. She is the only one here who has not lied to me. Something in the room changed at those words. Not just status. Moral gravity. Nia placed both hands on the keyboard. Audit trees opened in branching columns. Treasury pathways. Escrow nodes. Signatory ladders. Her fingers moved faster, but beneath the speed she felt memory guiding her. Old contract logic patterns once studied in fluorescent-lit libraries, overlooked knowledge now carrying the weight of thousands of livelihoods. Sweat gathered at Martin's temple. 16 minutes. 15. There, Nia whispered. A recursive authorization loop nested behind Mercer's mirror key. Elegant, hidden, dangerous. But flawed. If I duplicate the duplicate, I can force it to authenticate against itself. Martin stared. That creates null confirmation. Richard almost breathed a laugh of disbelief. Do it. Nia entered the override sequence. The cursor blinked once, twice, then froze. Her pulse surged. Why did it stop? Richard asked. Nia read the prompt and felt cold move through her. Final authorization required Chief Executive biometric confirmation. Richard stepped beside her. The scanner lit blue. He placed his hand against the glass. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the system requested secondary ethical compliance verification, a protocol no one had used in years. Martin whispered, stunned, it needs a second officer to certify fiduciary harm. Richard looked at the board. No one moved. Then slowly, he turned to Nia. Miss Carter, he said, voice almost reverent now, place your hand beside mine. For a moment Nia did not move. The blue light from the biometric scanner washed over the polished edge of the desk and caught in the glass wall beyond, turning the room almost dreamlike, suspended between catastrophe and deliverance. Richard's hand remained on the scanner, steady now, the hand that had nearly signed away an empire only minutes before. Beside him, space waited for hers. Around the table no one spoke. Even Mercer, even Benton, had gone still, as though some older authority had entered the room and all of them felt it. Nia lifted her hand slowly. Her fingers trembled, not from fear alone but from the strange gravity of being invited into a place history had not prepared her to occupy. The daughter of a courthouse janitor, standing beside a chief executive to certify the moral survival of a corporation. She placed her hand against the illuminated glass. The scanner pulsed once beneath both palms. A soft tone sounded. Dual compliance verification accepted. No one breathed. On the terminal, the recursive override sequence resumed, code moving line by line like a current through dark water. 11 minutes until release. Then 10. Nia's eyes tracked each authentication layer while Martin whispered legal cross-checks under his breath. Richard said nothing. He simply stood beside her, close enough that she could hear the measured cadence of his breathing. It was the first quiet in the room that did not feel hostile. Outside, the sun had fallen lower, leaving the Hudson silver blue under gathering evening, ferries reduced to drifting lights. Inside, something softened in the long tension, not resolution, but recognition. Richard looked down at the second hand beside his on the scanner and said, almost too low to hear, "I laughed when you spoke." Nia kept her eyes on the code. "Yes, sir." The honesty carried no accusation. Only fact. He nodded once. "That was my blindness." The words landed in a silence heavier than apology. Martin glanced up but said nothing. Some truths needed no witness. 8 minutes. The recursive loop reached its final branch and stalled again, this time at ethical conflict arbitration. A dormant protocol no one expected. The screen asked whether preserving shareholder value outweighed protection of employee livelihoods. A question so stark it seemed almost human. Richard stared at it. For decades his world had rewarded one answer. Yet tonight the room had been remade. He looked toward the darkened reflection in the glass where thousands of unseen office lights had begun to flicker across Manhattan. "Protect the workers," he said. Nia entered the selection. Confirmation requested. She pressed execute. Nothing happened. Then a slow processing wheel turned. Once. Twice. Every second stretched. Mercer closed his eyes. Benton bowed his head. 6 minutes. The wheel disappeared. Access denied. A collective breath broke in shock. Martin swore under his breath. "There is a manual conflict objection," Nia said, scanning deeper. "Filed by a fiduciary dissenter." She looked up. Benton. The old director did not defend himself. He only seemed tired. Richard stepped away from the scanner and walked to Benton's chair. No fury. No threats. Just a long look between men who had built something together and broken something too. "Withdraw it," Richard said. Benton studied him, then Nia, then the skyline beyond the glass. At last he reached for the keyboard with slow arthritic fingers and removed the objection. "I forgot," he murmured, almost to himself, "that companies are people before they are numbers." He pressed confirm. The override resumed. 4 minutes. 3. The release clock blinked red. Then, with a muted chime softer than rainfall, the terminal displayed transfer nullified. Asset conversion cancelled. Treasury channels locked. For several seconds no one reacted, as if relief itself was difficult to trust. Then Martin leaned back and laughed once in disbelief. Richard closed his eyes briefly, not in triumph but release. Nia looked at the screen glowing calm blue and felt the enormous silence after a storm. But in that silence an internal message appeared at the bottom of the terminal, newly generated, flagged urgent from Federal Compliance Review. Richard opened his eyes and read the first line. His face changed again. "Tomorrow morning," he whispered, "regulators arrive." The words "regulators arrive" did not trigger panic the way betrayal had. They triggered something quieter and more dangerous, accountability. The room that had nearly broken apart under secrecy now faced the colder light of truth made public. Richard kept reading the Federal Compliance Notice, each line reflected faintly in the darkened window beside him. Preliminary Review. Emergency Audit. Presence required at 8 o'clock. The inquiry had begun before tonight's attempted transfer was stopped, which meant the danger had reached farther than any of them knew. Martin adjusted his glasses and took the screen. "They suspect internal misconduct already." His voice carried no dramatics now, only sober precision. Mercer shifted in his seat as though considering escape through some remaining argument, but the old confidence was gone. Benton stared at the tabletop, fingers motionless over the abandoned yellow pad. Nia felt fatigue move into her shoulders for the first time, the kind that arrives only after survival. Yet beneath it another thought formed. If regulators come tomorrow, she said, they will assume the concealment succeeded unless they see tonight's intervention as voluntary disclosure. Richard looked up immediately. He understood before she finished. Narrative itself had become a battleground. Not whether fraud occurred, but whether the company confronted it or concealed it. We report before dawn, Richard said. A board member blinked in disbelief. Self-report? Richard turned. Yes. The answer came with a certainty no one had heard from him all day. Perhaps because certainty rooted in humility sounds different than certainty rooted in power. But Martin hesitated. If we disclose tonight, markets may punish us at opening. Richard gave a faint, almost weary smile. Markets can recover. Integrity does not, once sold. The room absorbed it in silence. Even Benton lifted his head. For a moment Nia saw not a chief executive speaking to investors but a man hearing himself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. Then Martin frowned at the notice again. There is an issue. He pointed to a line near the bottom. The audit request had been triggered by an anonymous whistleblower complaint filed 3 weeks earlier. Richard read the source identifier and went still. The complaint had originated from inside compliance overflow. From Nia's division. He turned slowly toward her. You filed this? The question held no accusation. Only astonishment. Nia hesitated. There had been no plan to reveal it. I submitted an irregularity report after noticing discrepancies in escrow routing, she said quietly. It was ignored. Martin looked stunned. Ignored by whom? Nia's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward Mercer. The room understood. Mercer gave a brittle laugh emptied of force. A support analyst attempted to accuse senior finance based on anomalies. Richard did not look at him. He looked only at Nia, as though recalibrating every assumption he had ever made about status and worth. You tried to stop this before today. She nodded once. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock anymore. It was recognition becoming moral reckoning. Richard walked slowly back to the head of the table, but did not sit in his own chair. Instead he placed a hand on its back and said to the board, the woman you dismissed saved this company twice. Once with truth. Once with courage before anyone listened. No one challenged him. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the glass, fine spring rain silver under city lights. Mercer lowered his eyes. Benton exhaled long, almost like confession. Then Richard did something none of them expected. He pulled his chair away from the head of the table and turned it toward Nia. Tomorrow when regulators arrive, he said, you sit beside me. Her breath caught. Sir, I am not an officer. Richard's expression softened. Tonight you were. Before she could answer, Martin's phone vibrated against the wood. He checked the screen and color left his face. Richard, he whispered. The Zurich delegation has requested emergency re-entry to the meeting. They want back in. Richard frowned. Why now? Martin lifted his eyes. Because they say they were not the ones who designed the trap. Rain traced thin silver lines down the glass as the Zurich delegation re-entered the boardroom, but the atmosphere had changed so completely they seemed to step into a different world than the one they had left an hour before. The lead negotiator, Elias Voss, no longer carried the smooth certainty of a man closing a profitable acquisition. His tie was loosened, his expression grave. He placed a leather folio on the table and did not sit. We were manipulated as well, he said. No one answered. Richard remained standing beside Nia's chair, one hand resting lightly on the backrest as if protecting a boundary newly formed. Elias opened the folio and slid out a memorandum. Our legal team discovered after suspension that the override structure was inserted by a consulting intermediary neither side fully controlled. Martin scanned the document, brows knitting. Blackstone Meridian Advisory, he read. Benton looked up sharply. Mercer went pale in a way no accusation had managed before. Nia felt it immediately. This was the hidden layer beyond betrayal. A shadow actor moving above all of them. Elias continued. The intermediary designed the transfer logic to provoke governance collapse, then acquire distressed assets through a third vehicle. Richard's eyes narrowed. You are telling me both our firms were being positioned as prey? Elias nodded once. And your intervention prevented it. The word settled over the room with strange irony. The black analyst they had barely acknowledged had not merely saved Whitmore. She had prevented an international corporate ambush. Martin looked toward Mercer. Did you know Meridian controlled the advisory layer? Mercer stared at the rain-swept window before answering. I knew they promised returns. His voice sounded old. I did not know they meant to consume us too. No one rushed to condemn him now. Something deeper than blame was unfolding, a recognition that greed often begins by flattering intelligence. Richard turned slowly toward Nia. You saw a trap inside a trap. She gave the faintest shake of her head. I just kept reading. The simplicity of it made Elias almost smile. That may be rarer than genius. For the first time all evening a softness entered the room, not triumph, but human relief after surviving a machinery larger than any one person. Then Elias did something unexpected. He pushed a signed letter across the table. Zurich withdraws the acquisition. A director exhaled sharply. But Elias lifted a hand. And proposes instead a worker equity partnership, conditioned on ethics oversight independent from both boards. His gaze moved to Nia. Led by her. Silence again, but not the old hostile silence. This one glowed. Richard looked at the proposal, then at Nia. You heard the man. She almost laughed from disbelief. Sir, I am still classified as support staff. Richard's expression changed, wounded by memory. Not for another minute. He walked to the head of the table and, before the full board, placed his own executive nameplate before her seat. The small engraved metal plate caught the blue city light. Nia Carter. Chief Ethics Counsel, handwritten beneath in Richard's own pen. Martin removed his glasses. Even Benton's eyes brightened with something close to peace. Mercer lowered his head, not destroyed, simply humbled. The room had begun in hierarchy and ended in moral inversion. Yet Nia looked at the nameplate and then at Richard. If I accept, she said softly, workers come first. No layoffs hidden inside reform. Richard nodded at once. Done. No negotiation. No ego. Only consent. Rain tapped gentler now, almost like applause against the windows. Elias gathered his folio. Then perhaps tonight did not stop a collapse, he said. Perhaps it started a better company. Richard looked toward the skyline where thousands of lights burned beyond the glass. Perhaps. Then he turned back to Nia, and in a voice so quiet only those nearest heard, he said, Can you forgive how I saw you this morning? Nia studied him for a long moment. Only if tomorrow you see everyone lower in this building differently. Richard's answer came without pause. I will. But as the board began to breathe again, a soft alert chimed from the terminal. An internal personnel file had auto-updated under federal review. Martin opened it, frowned, then slowly smiled in disbelief. Nia, he said, do you realize your original law license was never lapsed? Morning entered the building in pale silver bands through the east-facing glass, softer than the hard gold light that had filled the boardroom the day before. By 8 o'clock the long conference table had been cleared of emergency binders and scattered annex pages, yet something of the night remained in the air, like warmth held inside stone after sunset. Federal auditors moved quietly through adjoining rooms, their voices low, respectful, almost incidental to the deeper reckoning already completed. Nia sat beside Richard at the table, not as interruption now, but as presence. Her hands rested lightly on a closed legal folder, calm, unadorned, steady. The engraved nameplate before her caught a thread of morning light and reflected it onto the polished wood in a thin ribbon of silver. Richard noticed it and, for a moment, simply watched the reflection move as the sun climbed. There had been a time when he measured value in acquisition numbers, in quarterly calls, in the speed of signatures. This morning he seemed to listen instead to smaller things, the turning of pages, the hush of central air, the soft brush of rain drying on the windows. Across the floor below, employees began arriving, coats over their arms, paper cups warming their hands, unaware how narrowly a different future had passed them by. Richard looked down through the glass wall at the stream of ordinary people entering the lobby, and his face softened with a gravity no triumph could imitate. When an assistant brought coffee, he stood to take the tray himself and thanked her by name. Martin noticed. So did Nia. Nothing was said. Some changes make no sound. Later, when the auditors departed and the city moved into full morning rhythm, the boardroom emptied one chair at a time until only Richard and Nia remained. No speeches. No ceremony. Just the hush after consequence. On the far wall the skyline shimmered through washed spring light, bridges faint in the distance, ferries tracing white lines across the Hudson. Richard removed his old chief executive nameplate from the head of the table and set it aside. Then, with deliberate hands, he straightened Nia's new one, though it was already aligned. A gesture almost invisible, but somehow larger than apology. She gathered her folder and rose. For a second neither moved toward the door. The silence between them held no discomfort, only understanding. Richard extended his hand, then seemed to reconsider, as if a handshake felt too small for what had changed. Instead he stepped aside and let her walk first. Nia crossed the long room, heels quiet against carpet, morning light following her along the glass. As she reached the doorway she paused, not turning back, only resting one hand against the frame as wind pressed faintly against the windows high above the avenue. In the reflection of the glass Richard could see her beside the skyline, no longer the unseen girl at the wall but part of the horizon itself. She moved on. He remained a moment longer, breathing in the stillness. Below, elevators opened and closed. Somewhere distant a printer started. Life continuing. When Richard finally left the room, he switched off nothing. The door eased shut behind him and the conference table stood empty in the quiet, two chairs still slightly angled toward one another. Sunlight traveled slowly across the polished wood until it rested over the silver letters of Nia Carter, and in that stillness, without witness or applause, the room seemed to hold the shape of justice.